Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Thanks so much for being here. What happened on Wednesday was not an insurrection. Language is incredibly important. We need to be precise especially when the rest of the media is trying to inflame tensions. While they're preaching about de-escalating, they're the ones doing the inflaming. Watch the left's language on this. They call it a coup or they call it an insurrection, and it was not. This is Michael Tracy. He says, only in the unhinged imaginations of hysterics was what happened on Wednesday an attempted coup. They're peddling this fantasy in order to give themselves justification for inflicting punishment on their political enemies and destroying civil liberties. Biden and Pelosi yesterday called it an insurrection. Is that de-escalating tensions? Right? They talk about the need for calm. And then they turn around and call it an insurrection. And then Biden and Kamala both bring in race. They make it a whole race thing. Like that'll calm tensions. An insurrection, okay? What would be an insurrection? An insurrection would be if President Trump got up there at the podium at his speech and raised an army. Like literally, I opened up the armory. All you ralliers, let's turn into a militia right now. Grab your guns. We're going in. Guns a-blazing. We're going to kill everyone we find, and we're literally going to take over the Capitol building for more than like an hour. It's just what happened yesterday or Wednesday. A coup would be if Trump had the generals and brigades behind him ready to, that's a coup. That's an insurrection. A break. What happened on Wednesday, an insurrection? You can only say what happened on Wednesday was an insurrection if you have lived such a privileged life that you've never actually lived through an insurrection or actual political violence. An insurrection has happened in countries around the world and throughout all of history. To call this an insurrection, that is privilege. But this is what we do in our culture today. We've infantilized everyone. All right, we've turned everyone into little babies. I saw a tweet from, I don't know if it was a black congressman or I don't know who it was. A bunch of congressmen were tweeting out I'm okay, right? Because they're inside, I'm okay. And this guy tweeted out, I thought I was okay, but now, he tweeted out the picture of some guy holding a Confederate flag. And he goes, but after seeing the flag, I'm not okay. I'm just not okay anymore. It's like, man, get a grip of yourself. You would have made a horrible member of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment during the Civil War made up of black soldiers. Right? You would have been in the 54th and you would have seen the Confederate flag in the distance just keeled up. I can't even. Man, we've infantilized everyone, turned everyone into little babies. And we've catastrophized everything. Infantilized and catastrophized. My son, he's 4. He was riding his bike yesterday. It was his second day of riding his bike. And he fell. And good thing maybe mom wasn't there, although mom's really good with this stuff. She doesn't turn our kids into babies either. But what do you think? I was like, oh, Jack, are you okay? That was the worst crash I've ever seen in my life. Do you think he'd ever get back on his bicycle again? Of course not. I said, yeah, that was awesome, Jack. What a crash. Did you get any blood? No blood. Darn it. All right, let's go faster this time. Because I'm not in the business of infantilizing my kids or catastrophizing their lives, which is what the media does to all of us. I think yesterday we made the point about people comparing this to the War of 1812. Are you out of your minds? The War of 1812. If you ask someone who lived through the War of 1812 in D.C., which they would rather relive, that the British bombing our nation's capital or Wednesday, they would have chosen Wednesday. Jake Tapper on CNN called it a MAGA terrorist insurrection. A MAGA terrorist insurrection. That is a deliberate inflation of what happened, designed to stoke maximum hysteria. And you want to know why? CNN got their highest ratings ever on Wednesday. Highest ratings ever. That's the first point. Second point, I want to steal a point here from Jack Murphy. I understand the people on Wednesday. I understand their rage. I get it. I understand Black Lives Matter's rage. I understand it. The difference is you can't act like the left. You can't do it. Nor should you, but you can't. Black Lives Matter, Antifa, they are in political and ideological and cultural alignment with the corporations and the media and all of our cultural institutions. You are not. So they can riot, and they're heralded as great patriots fighting against the man, truth to power, right? People on the right do these things, and you're just destroyed by those same institutions and those same people in them. You get no cover from the media. Black Lives Matter activists have burned down buildings. Like literally there was one in Minneapolis maybe. I remember they burned down, under construction, it was a low-income housing complex. I think it was like built by like the local church or something. They just burned it to the ground and they get cover. They get cover for burning down buildings. Meanwhile, this guy is going to get 10 years in prison. Okay? So the right has to have a different strategy than the left. The left can riot and burn down buildings. You can't. Nor should you. But know that you can't anyway. Because the end result of what happened on Wednesday is, see, they're fascists, just like we said they were. And now we got to get rid of them all. Wednesday is going to be used in the continued inflaming of all this. By the way, what would be the rational response? The rational response from Joe Biden would be, man, what happened on Wednesday was terrible. That was awful. Hey, let's move on here. You know, we're better than this. Let's unite over these first principles. Boom. And that's it. As opposed to, the insurrection, unbelievable. Nancy Pelosi talking about the 25th Amendment, trying to just squeeze every last bit of anti-Trump hysteria she can out of the next 12 days. And they're doing that because they're going to get a Patriot Act 2.0 out of this. And it's super frustrating because there were, like 200 people who got inside the Capitol? I wonder if we'll ever get a real number. Versus Black Lives Matter and Antifa. Antifa was small, was a small group, way more destructive than what happened yesterday, that's for sure. But still small. By the way, this is LA Times. LA Times had a photo essay. The title was called Calm After the Storm. Photos of cleanup following the siege on the US Capitol. And there were 7 pictures, and this was one of them. Wow. How will we recover? The other pictures were like of a broken window. But that siege, the great siege of 2021. Crazy. Anyway, Black Lives Matter is a much, much larger movement, embraced by corporations and most people mindlessly. But even the violent factions are way bigger than what happened on Wednesday. But because they're politically and ideologically aligned with the left, they're going to get a pass. Not only are they going to get a pass, you will be forced at your work and your kids will be forced at their school to recite the Black Lives Matter philosophy, or else you're a racist. Trump's not aligned with any institutions that exist in this country. So he and his supporters have been and will, like we've never seen before, be removed from polite society. After the election, you heard the left literally talk about lists. They used the word lists. We need a list of every politician who worked for Trump or supported Trump, or every businessman who supported Trump, every person who. We got to put them on a list. It's cancel culture. It's not going away, and it's going to get real. And these rioters poured kerosene on it. That's why I'm ticked off at them. It gave the left, these rioters gave the left all the justification they need to shut you down even more. We know what came after 9/11. The Patriot Act, because terrorists attacked this country. That's why the left are calling the rioters on Wednesday terrorists. Black Lives Matter, Antifa, they were never terrorists. Antifa literally took over police departments and set up autonomous zones in major cities across the country. They were never called terrorists. They were called, it was a block party, a summer of love. The rioters on Wednesday are called terrorists. You will be called a terrorist. You incited terrorism. And you too need to be removed from polite society, they'll say. They've been saying. If the pandemic wasn't reason enough to strip you of your liberties, Wednesday was, and that's super frustrating. Coming up next, I want to talk about magnanimity and what that looks like. And then we got a wonderful guest coming up in the third segment as well. I'll say this, and we'll talk more about this on Monday. I think people think and hope always that when a bad thing happens, that this is the end. No. If you've ever had an addict in your life, everyone talks about rock bottom, and you're like, oh, surely this is rock bottom. And then they do something and you're like, oh, this has to be rock bottom. No, we're not even close. It's still very much the beginning. I'm just glad we're here together for it. True story. Mike Slater. Let's come back and talk about magnanimity with Trump and his concession. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, let's talk about what Trump needs to do now moving forward. And this is in light of the address he gave yesterday as well. Trump conceded, which everyone knew he would do eventually, especially everyone in the media. Right? There was this idea from 4 years ago that he would never leave office, that he was a dictator who would never leave. This hysterical panic for literally 4 years. And yes, he fought to the end. Wednesday was the end. And if people didn't break into the Capitol on Wednesday, he still would have conceded. That's important to know. So that's the end. But I want to take this opportunity to talk about a virtue that is not often talked about or thought about. And I think this is a good time for Trump and others to have it and show it and live it and cultivate it from this point forward. It's magnanimity. Super fun word to say, and we're going to see how many times I can say it here correctly in the next 10 minutes. Magnanimity and being magnanimous. Darn it! Messed up already. People talk about humility. That's good. Humility is very good. Magnanimity is related. This is an interview that we did back in August with Spencer Klavan. Spencer Klavan, classicist. He's got a great podcast, and he's the editor of the Claremont Review of Books. And here's what he said. We did a segment on virtue and on ancient virtues, and one of them was this one.
A great one is magnanimity, bigness of soul and heart. And that's another kind of, that gets perverted into, you just owe everybody reparations. You have to give out all your money. If you've got something, you didn't build that, so you owe it to everybody. But magnanimity is having something and having a liberality of soul that would enable you to engage in things like actual charity, right? To choose. I don't have to give you this gift, but I do out of the goodness of my heart. That's true virtue, and you can't have it in, for example, a socialist state where you're considered to owe everything to everybody.
Magnanimity. What is it? What's the root of that word?
So magnum is the Latin word for big, and anima is the word for soul. So big souledness, this kind of expansiveness of heart and soul is magnanimity.
It's got to be more than generous, though, right? So take me there, because it's bigger than what I'm thinking. So I think generous, but what else is it?
Well, you might also be magnanimous in a situation where you've been wronged. And this has to do with forgiveness, right? You might also have such a big, we talk about somebody being a big man, being the bigger man. And so admitting that you were wrong, admitting that other people have wronged you, but you're going to offer them forgiveness, that's an example of magnanimity. It has to do with this just expansiveness because you are so abundant in your soul that you don't need these petty forms of recognition, or you don't need, the $5 that you're going to, lend to this guy or whatever. So it goes all the way down to money, but it also goes all the way up to things like spiritual gifts of forgiveness.
That's such a great clip. Don't you think that's so? Turn down his bass a little bit, make me sound like a pipsqueak. I love that line. You're so abundant in your soul. It's just overflowing. You don't need petty forms of recognition. You don't need that last 5, but that's so good. Magnanimity. Let me get some dictionary definitions here because I want to make sure we are totally rock solid on what this means. Loftiness of spirit, enabling one to bear trouble calmly. Ooh, good one. So that goes back, as opposed to what we talked about in the last segment, catastrophizing everything, right? Like people in the media are not bearing trouble calmly, right? To disdain meanness and pettiness and to display a noble generosity. Aristotle talked about, this was one of his virtues as well. Here's Noah Webster. Greatness of mind, that elevation or dignity of soul, which encounters danger and trouble with tranquility and firmness, which raises the possessor above revenge, makes him delight in acts of benevolence, which makes him disdain injustice and meanness, and prompts him to sacrifice personal ease, that's good, sacrifice personal ease, interest and safety for the accomplishment of useful and noble objects. Excellent, excellent. All right, we need to study this a lot more. So we're gonna brainstorm examples of magnanimity in history. I think one of the top examples has to be Ulysses S. Grant. Robert E. Lee surrendering to Ulysses S. Grant in the Civil War. So they met together, and first they talked about they shot the breeze about their service in the Mexican-American War. And then they got down to business, and they talked about the terms of surrender. And Grant, on the Union side, wrote out that all the weapons and supplies are going to be captured property. And Robert E. Lee, he said, hey, can my men keep their horses? And Grant said, sure, your officers can keep their horses. And Lee said, actually, no, I meant, could all my men keep their horses, not just the officers? And Grant realized he didn't think that all of the soldiers would own their own horses. It's a different cultural thought there. So Grant said, yes, of course. Your soldiers, they probably own small farms and they're gonna need horses to work the fields and feed their families this year. So yes, of course, everyone can keep their horses. Everyone can keep their sidearms and their swords. And then Grant ordered his supply officer to give them enough rations for 25,000 Confederate soldiers who haven't eaten in days. When Grant made it back to the Union side, they started celebrating and cheering and shooting cannons in the air. And Grant told the men to stop. He said, the rebels are our countrymen again. We can best show our joy by refusing to celebrate their downfall. That is a generousness of soul, right? That's an overpouring of generosity. That's magnanimity. I'll give you a more modern example. We talked 2 days ago. 2 days ago? Yeah, 2 days ago. With, this week has been like 3 weeks. We're only 8 days into January, or into 2021. So a more modern example, a couple days ago, we talked with a former congressman from Sacramento, California, Congressman O.C., good conservative man. And he talked about being in Congress on the congressional floor when Al Gore was vice president in 2000, and he was going over the certificate of electors that he was obviously a part of. I want to play a clip of it here. So it's 30 minutes of this, but it was just like what we started to see on Wednesday, where the vice president gets up there and he goes over the states, and if anyone has an objection, you can come up and you can object. So congressmen kept coming up and objecting, but the problem is they didn't have a senator. Remember, you need one congressman, you need one senator in writing in order to object, and they didn't have any senators. But the congressmen, just as like a symbolic act of protest or whatever, kept coming up and saying they object. And then Al Gore would be like, well, do you have a senator? And they'd say no. And then he'd say, well, you're out of order. And they kept doing it over and over and over again. So just as an example of it, here's Maxine Waters.
I rise to object to the fraudulent 25 Florida electoral votes. Is the objection in writing and signed by a member of the House and a senator?
The objection is in writing, and I don't care that it is not signed by a member of the Senate.
The chair will advise that the rules do care, and the signature of the senator. The signature of a senator is required. The chair will again put that part of the question: is the objection signed by a senator?
Mr. Vice President, there are gross violations of the Voting Rights Act from Florida.
The
And I
gentlewoman,
object, and it is not signed by a senator.
the chair thanks the gentlewoman from California on the basis previously stated. The point of order may not be received. Gentleman will suspend. The gentleman will suspend. The chair thanks the gentleman from Illinois, but hey, on the basis previously stated, the objection is not in order.
Very good. All right, so here's the former congressman telling us about this the other day.
My daughters were with me on the floor. They were 8 and 6 at the time. So they were kind of oblivious to the seriousness of the issue. But when the proceeding was over and when the chambers were virtually empty, Vice President Gore was still down in the well of the House, you know, conversing with people and taking well wishes and all that. So I said, girls, come on, let's go down and meet the Vice President. So literally, there was nobody else in the building, so to speak. So we walk down, we wait our turn, and we're at the end of the line, and we finally get to the head of the line, and I go, Mr. Vice President, I'm Congressman O.C. We don't know each other from Boo. I wanted to bring my daughters down here and introduce them to you. And the amazing thing to me was that Vice President Gore, on the worst day of his political life, got down on one knee and talked to my daughters as if nothing else in the world was going on.
It's magnanimity right there. So there's room for Trump to still do this. I know people get like, it's like, oh, but this is the biggest deal. You don't think Lee was upset about losing the Civil War? Right? Great men have seen great defeat. And I hate to say this, and listen, I think one of the greatest things about Trump is that he prevented Hillary from being president, right? But even Hillary went to the inauguration. You pick up the pieces, you move on. You lick your wounds. Lee went back to his side. He said, boys, I've done the best I could do for you. Go home now. And if you make as good citizens as you've made soldiers, you will do well. I think Trump's message last night was about right. It's like, listen, guys, yesterday was awful. Other than that, you fought hard and well. It's time to move on. Biden's the president. Let's shore up our election integrity moving forward. Let's stop mail-in voting for future elections. Let's get back to first principles. Let's make sure America remains the greatest country in the world. Right, that's the message. And then go to the inauguration and shake hands with Biden. If Robert E. Lee could do it, so can Trump. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. So I like to think of myself as a student of human nature. Once you understand human nature, then all the events that happen start to make a lot more sense. It's a wonderful new book out. The foreword is by a good friend of ours, Rod Dreher, and the book is called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self: Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to Sexual Revolution. And it is by the professor at Grove City College of Pennsylvania, Carl Trueman. Mr. Trueman, how are you, sir?
I'm doing very well. And yourself?
Wonderful, and thank you for being here. We got lots to talk about. So one of the lines in the book is, and I want to ask you one question before this, but you say we've become a highly individualized, iconoclastic, sexual obsessed culture in the West. And I want to talk about what all those things mean. But what were we before that? Because I've only lived in a highly individualistic, sexually obsessed culture. So I've been swimming in this soup my whole life. What was prior to that?
Yeah, well, I think the sexual question needs to be set in the broader context of how people thought of themselves in general. And the answer to that question is that in times past, we tended to think of ourselves in terms of how we related to others outwardly. If I could give a simple example, ask my grandfather if he had job satisfaction working on a factory production line for many, many years. He'd have said yes, because he was able to earn enough money to put shoes on his children's feet and food on the table. Ask me the same question, and I'm going to say, yeah, I get job satisfaction because standing in front of a class gives me a great kick. I get a buzz out of teaching. If you think about those two answers, for my grandfather, satisfaction was really derived from looking outwardly, fulfilling his obligations towards others, we might say. For me, satisfaction is found by getting that inner sense of psychological happiness. And that reflects this big shift from, I would say, an outward-directed notion of what it means to be a human being focused on others to an inward-directed one focused on myself.
So important. Okay, how did we go from A to B?
That's a long story. It takes me 400 pages to do that, and I don't give the whole story even then. I think what we see really in the 18th century among what we would now call the cultural elites is an increasing preoccupation with the inner life, an increasing preoccupation with, we might say, psychology, with happiness conceived of as that inner sense of psychological satisfaction. And what we've seen really over the last 300 years is the steady percolation down to that of all levels of society. I mean, that's the message that is now communicated not simply through great romantic poetry, but through soap operas, sitcoms, the items of culture we all consume on a regular basis. All press home on us, if you like, that the meaning of life is us and our own psychological personal happiness.
Which is so fleeting because there's no even definition of it, right? It's impossible to achieve. You'd think we would have realized this by now, no?
Yeah, I mean, when you think of the American Declaration of Independence, of course, I'm a British citizen, so I have interesting opinions of America's independence. But the Declaration says you have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is a great idea. And of course, the founders had a very specific notion of what happiness would consist of. It was intimately connected to their notion of virtue. Now we live in a society where the notion of happiness has been detached from the virtues as the founders would have understood them, and it's become a highly subjective thing. What makes you happy is not necessarily what makes me happy, and I'm not going to get in your way, and you shouldn't get in my way when I'm pursuing my view of happiness.
Yeah, guys, we talk all the time about how words change in our, Orwellian world. Maybe one of the worst word de-evolutions over time is happiness, right? Because if our founders put in the pursuit of virtue, it would have been much more clear, even though that's what they meant, right?
Yeah, I mean, for them, happiness is intimately connected to a certain social way of life. For us, happiness simply means whatever gives me that inner sense of psychological satisfaction. And if that means that I have to ride roughshod over the values of the past, then so be it. If those values get in the way of my personal happiness, then frankly, they've got to go.
Yes, wow. Okay, can you give me a couple of, I love that. So what'd you put? A social way of life. What are some virtues that improve our social way of life?
Well, I would argue that traditionally, one of the things that we need to understand is that human beings are all dependent upon each other. At the heart of the sort of Rousseau romantic trajectory, which is the one we live in the wake of today, is the idea that man is born free and everywhere is in chains. Clearly, that's nonsense. Man is not born free. Man is born incredibly dependent upon his parents, more dependent upon his parents than other animals are upon theirs for a longer period of time. So I would say the first thing that we need to do is acknowledge our dependence upon other people, that life is not all about us, that we are actually here primarily to serve others, to serve the community, and to find our happiness and our satisfaction primarily in that. And that's something I think that the modern cultural imagination has lost, that we tend to think we exist for our own sake and not for the sake of our neighbors and those around us.
So obviously we live in a fallen world and we're sinful people and we're narcissistic people by our nature. Is it that we used to have a religious ethic or a Christian ethic that fought against that and helped us to strive against it? And then since Rousseau on, we now have a cultural ethic that embraces that sinfulness in us? How would you word that better?
Yeah, I think you're definitely onto something there. It's what I would call, we have a different social imaginary now. Now, that's a slightly awkward term, but what I mean by that is the air we breathe, the way our intuitions are formed is profoundly different to the way it was in the past. Now, I wouldn't want to say that people in the Middle Ages were any less sinful or fallen than people today, but that sinfulness and that fallenness manifested itself in different ways. Today, it manifests itself very much in the cult of the self. And it's not that we wake up each morning and think back to first principles and come up with an elaborate philosophy that places me at the center of everything. So say it's the very air that we breathe. Our imaginations are formed by everything in our culture to think of ourselves in that way.
Wow. Okay, give me a couple of examples. I want to be more aware. I want to be more sensitive to how I do that, and then we'll give some more examples of how in our modern world even we can live more of an external for others, right? So what are some examples of how we live this way?
Well, one could sort of point to Christianity in some ways and say, how do Christians, a lot of Christians, think about church these days? We tend to choose our church on the basis of what it does for us. Does it make us feel good? Is the worship to our taste? We have a kaleidoscopic variety of churches to choose from, and we tend to consume churches like we might consume other consumerist products. I would say that's a good example of how this kind of individualism has crept into Christianity. In actual fact, we should discipline ourselves to try to support the local church, the church nearby where the gospel is preached, et cetera, and set aside our personal preferences to a large extent. How can we operate on this basis in wider society? I think one of the simple things, which is really at a great discount at the moment, would be treating others with some degree of respect. I mean, it's sort of stating the obvious, but when you see how people routinely treat each other on Twitter and social media today, how we tend to regard anyone who disagrees with us as an enemy, I think one of the ways we can improve is to realize that there's a universal human dignity, and that those we disagree with should still be treated with respect as other human beings, as connected to us by their humanity.
Have you thought about this narcissistic versus giving differences when it comes to marriage and or parenting?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, marriage would be a great example. How do most people think about marriage today? Well, the whole culture of no-fault divorce really sets marriage forth as a voluntary relationship between two people for the mutual happiness of those two people that can simply be dissolved as soon as one or both parties decide it's not making them happy anymore. Now, contrast that with the view of marriage that sees it as a lifelong bond to be dissolved only in the most extreme of circumstances. And then think about the impact that has. If, perish the thought, I or my wife descend into the darkness of Alzheimer's disease later in life, does the other partner have the right simply to get out of the relationship at that point because it's no longer emotionally satisfying? I don't think so. And again, when it comes to parenting, what's the task of a parent? So the task of a parent, I think, is not to affirm the child. The task of a parent is to train the child to stand on their own 2 feet so that they can go on into wider society and become productive members of that society and hopefully parents themselves. So the idea of sort of child-centered parenting would strike me as a profoundly narcissistic or expressive individualist way of parenting.
Wow, which actually brings us to Rousseau. But real quick, there's many great insights I'm learning from you and as I finish the book. But perish the thought is an expression that I'm going to steal from you. I like that a lot. Perish the thought.
It's a good English expression.
Rousseau. So you mentioned Rousseau already. Born free, always living in chains. We did a segment on Rousseau a while back. We did a quick little study about how he was really just like a terrible, not just like, he was a terrible, terrible person. In so many ways, a troubled soul. And with parenting, he just dropped his sort of illegitimate children off at the orphanage to die. Just like horrible. And we get parenting advice from him, which is bizarre. What's one of the main themes that he's contributed to our narcissistic culture today?
I think the key thing about Rousseau is that he's the man who says, you know, that which you feel inside, that voice inside you, that's the real you. Now, it's a long way from Rousseau to transgenderism, but it stands on the same trajectory where the thing that is most real about you is that inner psychological voice. Rousseau is the man who really starts that ball rolling in Western culture. Clearly, it's been prepared for by other thinkers in the past, but he's the man who really places, you know, what goes on in here at the center of the notion of identity.
As opposed to what? He was living in a culture that said what was who you are.
Well, as opposed to a culture where identity is defined by your external circumstances, to which you then have to conform yourself. If you think of the Bible or think of Russian novels, what's quite remarkable about them is the number of patronymics that are given. You always hear about so-and-so is the son of somebody else. Well, think about what's going on there. You're being told that this person counts, not because of who they are in themselves, but because of who their people are, where they are located in the broader social structure. And Rousseau is the guy who's really sort of rebelling in some ways against that and saying, no, you aren't the situation you're born into. You're not the network of the established relationships in which you find yourself. You are whoever you want to be. You are the person you are inside.
It's so interesting because I can see how that first thing you said could be taken to an extreme that's not necessarily healthy either. And when you said the word conform, I, in my American individualism, was like, ooh, like I even, you know, and I'm with you. I agree. And even when you said conform, I was like, I don't want to conform. What do we do with that?
Well, I think one of the things we need to do with that is reconfigure our understanding of freedom. I think freedom for, certainly deep in the American project, and probably in the Western project as a whole now, freedom is understood essentially in a kind of libertarian way, that I'm free to do what I want. In actual fact, I think we need to think about freedom more in terms of freedom is about finding out who I am, where I fit, and living accordingly. The man who thinks he's a bird and jumps off the top of a building is exerting his libertarian freedom, and he's going to plunge to his death. The man who realizes, I'm not a bird but a man, and I'm going to live like a man, he is conforming to his nature, but I would say is arguably demonstrating more freedom than the one who is jumping off the building, who frankly one would say is deluded and in slavery to a delusion.
Wow. An Aesop fable, Aesop literally had a fable, the eagle and the crow, which proves that exact same point. All right. Hopefully we've inspired enough people to go buy the book and we can talk again. The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It's available right now. It's just a couple bucks. Carl Trueman. Thank you, Carl. Wonderful. Appreciate you.
Thanks for having me on.
Have a wonderful day. The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, unfortunately. Unfortunate triumph. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, I love talking about human nature, and I like trying to understand how we got to where we are today. How do we live in such a narcissistic, fallen world? I got 3 things I want to share here in our final few minutes of the week, of this long week. First, I'll start off with a fact. The more that people abandon religious spaces to meet their existential needs, the more likely they are to turn to extreme political tribalism. Fact. People look for meaning in life, We used to find that meaning in religion and religious spaces. The more atheist of a culture we become, the more we look for that meaning in politics. Atheists forever have been wanting to get religion out of our culture, right? Out of our public space, out of our shared experience. Because they think that if they do that, we'll have a more pure and rational world. No, that's not how that works. People will just replace the, as they say, irrationality of religion with the irrationality of political worship and political idolatry, right? Atheists and people wonder why so many conservatives worshiped Trump. Well, it's the same reason why so many people on the left worshiped Obama. We're all looking for a savior. And if you don't find it in the savior, you'll find it in someone else. We don't have time for this, but people on the left, atheists, they have this storyline in their by religious fighting, and they jump right to the Crusades in their ignorance to prove that point to themselves and others. They say, if we just get rid of religion, right? Like John Lennon said, imagine there's no heaven, right? That's it. And then things will be great. Then we'll just all get along. And then there'll be no countries, and then there'll be no possessions, and we can all live in our communist utopia together. But first, we have to get rid of that opiate of the masses. That's not how it works. If we get rid of religion, then we fill that void that used to be filled by a healthy religious devotion and instead replace it with idol worship. And oftentimes, as our last guest said, that tends to be self-worship. Hence, self-help books, when what people really need is Jesus-help books. And even if you look at the Christian faith, even on its most secular, practical level, it's serving others over self. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another, right? Even just from the most secular, just that alone, we need more of. All right, so the first point is when people abandon religion, they turn to political tribalism and worship of the self, narcissism. Second point, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. In 1983, he won the Templeton Prize. It was a religious prize. And he gave a speech. It's an amazing speech, and we could spend an hour on it. We should spend an hour on it. And he said when he was a kid, he remembered hearing old people say that the cause of all the problems in Russia was that men have forgotten God. That's why all of this has happened. He said, I've spent 50 years working on the history of the revolution. And in the process, I've read hundreds of books, collected hundreds of personal testimonies, have contributed 8 volumes of my own. But if I were asked today to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause of the ruinous revolution that has swallowed up some 60 million of our people, I could not put it more accurately than to repeat, men have forgotten God. That's why this has happened. The failings of human consciousness, deprived of its divine dimension, have been a determining factor in the major crimes of this century. In the past, Russia did know a time when the social ideal was not fame or riches or material success, the self, but in a pious way of life, others. Exactly what our last guest was talking about. Faith was the shaping and unifying force of the nation. Men have forgotten God. That's why this has happened. Third point, Rene Guano. He's a French guy, early 1900s. I got a bunch to quote here. Let's do this. A word that rose to honor at the time of the Renaissance, Rousseau, and that summarized in advance the whole program of modern civilization is humanism. Men were indeed concerned to reduce everything to purely human proportions, to eliminate every principle of a higher order, and one might say symbolically to turn away from the heavens under pretext of conquering the earth. The desire to reduce everything to the measure of a man as an end in himself, the self, modern civilization has sunk stage by stage until it's reached the level of the lowest elements in man and aims at little more than satisfying the needs inherent in the material side of his nature, an aim that is in any case quite illusory since it constantly creates more artificial needs than it can satisfy. It's exactly what we talked about in the last segment. Will the modern world follow this fatal course right to the end, or will a new readjustment intervene once more before it reaches the bottom of the abyss into which it's being drawn? He says, we've entered the last phase of the darkest period of the Dark Age. I disagree with that. I think we're just beginning it. But the state of disillusion from which it is impossible to emerge otherwise than by a cataclysm, since it is not just a mere readjustment that is necessary at such a stage, but a complete renovation. I think that's right. It will take a cataclysm to get us out of this funk. And calling it a funk, that's putting narcissistic, godless decadence very nicely by calling it a funk. Selfish, narcissistic, godless decadence. We got to snap out of it. Snap out of this godless malaise. People think the triumph of man requires man to learn to stand taller and more, me. Tall like the Tower of Babel. No, bad things must happen. Bad things will happen. Much worse things than what happened on Wednesday. Bad things will happen to get people back on their knees. To worship not their political idol, but the King of Kings. Have a wonderful weekend. See you on Monday. True story. Spread the word.